Welcome, everyone. This week's video blog is a little different than what you've seen me do over the past 14 months. I am excited to welcome a guest, actually a partner, a client of ours that we've had the fortune to work with on many occasions. Tony, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and being willing to do this. You do your introduction so much better than what I would give it justice. Would you share with our followers a little bit of what you do and your expertise?
Certainly. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you for having me today. So I'm Tony Pissarro. I've been with Deloitte for about 2.5 years now. I work as a neuroscientist for them to really see what we can leverage from neuroscience to improve our presentations, improve the sharing of our information with our clients in the hopes that we can win more deals. And prior to that, I worked in many different sectors. I worked with the military, the DoD, worked in a few hospitals. I worked in academia. So I've kind of been all over the place for the last 17 years, all within neuroscience, focusing on EEG, kind of reading brain waves, algorithm development, and kind of processing physiological signals. And so a lot of what I do currently with Deloitte is focus on the audience and how they perceive information as it's shared with them, as they read proposals, with the hopes that we can gain insight into what's resonating with our clients.
Your work was so impressive. I forget, Tony, the year that we've actually met. At that time, we were in person delivering our workshops at Deloitte. You had reached out to us. We learned from you and said, wait a second, we want you to come sit in a 2-day workshop, and then we want to learn from you. And your work is so impressive with how deep you take a look at how people respond to messages, which is why I wanted you to share with our large following through our video blogs on the work that we do with influence. You and I have talked several times prior to today. We both were in agreement that what we're hearing consistently from our clients and what you're hearing from your clients is this idea of Zoom fatigue. I'd love for our followers to learn from you, Tony, on what can we learn about neuroscience to perhaps manage some of this Zoom fatigue?
Yeah, it's an excellent topic. So the best way I can kind of summarize the direction we've started to focus in on is by a single finding with regard to one of our neuroscience tools, a galvanic skin response tool, or GSR tool, that measures sort of the level of engagement of an individual, of an audience member. So previously, when we were in person, we would notice that time and time again, every time we have a new speaker, a new slide, a new stimulus of some sort, we would see a spike in attention, and then it would slowly start to drop. By the time attention started wandering completely, it was about 2 minutes or so. As we've gone remote this last year, we've seen that shift. We've seen that go down to only about 1.5 minutes. So just about 90 seconds before attention starts to wander, unless you bring up a new slide, have a new speaker, change the stimulus somehow, some way. So that was really telling for us right off the bat. That told us, okay, we can't keep doing what we've been doing in person and expect attention to really be up. There's so many distractions in the home, whether it's the multitude of calls that you have, of people coming in, getting the fatigue by having one Zoom call after another. So really the onus then falls on us as presenters to try and initiate more surprise, try and do something different. Don't rely on what we've done in the past, where we can get away with, having slide after slide after slide without deviation. We really have to change things up. We notice that when we initiate more surprise, we punt between speakers more frequently, within reason, of course. We have more builds, animations, we play some videos. We have more interaction with the audience when we can, whether we're doing a polls or annotate feature. When we do these sorts of things, we alleviate that fatigue. We start to surprise the audience. What we don't want to happen is to have this next meeting just be sort of white noise among a whole bunch of other meetings. We want this to be unique and different, and it can't be just dependent on the content. It has to be dependent on how we execute on that content, how we deliver that content. So changing it up is very, very important. Some of the examples I gave before, in addition to that, giving breaks periodically, and just sort of being cognizant of everyone's attention on the other side of that call is very, very important to prevent sort of that Zoom fatigue.
Tony, you're supporting everything that we are constantly pushing out there with our clients is that this environment makes you work harder, be more focused, and the variety. Speaking of variety, you brought up the whole idea of slides. This is another conversation you and I have had several times. We struggle with the questions around our clients have these really detailed decks. It was always difficult to share detailed decks in person. To me, and I don't know if you agree, in this virtual platform, it's even more difficult. What can you share knowing that it is powerful to share our stories and our research and create a visual around the PowerPoint deck, but where really is that medium, or what's the recommendation based on neuroscience of how to effectively use a slide deck in this virtual environment?
Yes, that's an excellent question. That's sort of the $1 million question. So the main idea here, the main thing you want to you want to avoid risking is creating what's called cognitive dissonance for your audience, for your clients. And essentially what cognitive dissonance is sort of divergent processing pathways. So if what I'm reading on a slide diverges from what I'm hearing auditorially from the speaker, then that's an example of cognitive dissonance. And so what happens there is my attention is not so much on one important thing, it's on potentially one distracting thing. If that happens one time in a slide, that's okay. If it happens every slide throughout a presentation, that's problematic. That's where attention really starts to wander and our presentations really start to fall flat. So in person, we suggested less is more. We started talking about let's try and really reduce the content down so that we use the slide as a visual aid for the stories we're trying to tell and not the other way around. Oftentimes we have a proposal, we like to copy it, paste it into a slide deck, and then we kind of decide how we're going to talk about those points rather than going the other way around, figuring out what points we want to discuss, and then how can we complement that with some visual aid, whether it's some text, a video, maybe a short list, something along those lines. It's very important to kind of have that mentality going into it, because in the past, when we've been able to get by with these sort of lecture style presentations that can be somewhat monotonous, where we kind of have slide with lots of content after slide after slide, we're not able to do that remotely because what we just talked about attention being down, right? About the Zoom fatigue. So what we have to do is really try and augment that process, try and reduce down the slides such that there's only a few key words on there or key points, and we use that as a stepping stone to really start the conversation that we hope to have. So the focus is on our voice and less so on reading 1,000 words in a slide, because that just ends up being distracting. And more often than not, from a lot of the data we've seen, that can be a big stressor for the audience because they're stressed out that they're not going to finish reading in time. While they're stressing out, while they're reading all that, they're not listening to a single word the presenter is saying. So this can be really problematic. We can facilitate this using builds. In PowerPoint, we have the option to kind of segment things out with a build. So instead of saying, presenting 3 columns all at once with a lot of information, piecemeal it out. Have one column show up, a few points in there, talk about it, move on to the next column, and then the next one. When we do that, even if it's only on the really dense slides, we find that engagement and attention go up substantially. They really, really help to emphasize the important points that we're trying to make, which, by the way, we know audiences only remember about 10% of the information presented to them. So if we bombard them with all of this information simultaneously, it's unrealistic to expect them to not only pay attention to all of that, but to remember it. So really emphasizing your 10% message, not only within an entire presentation, but within each subsection, within each slide, is very, very important to ensure that they're paying attention. We don't run the risk of creating this idea of cognitive dissonance.
And both those two questions really tie together, because if you're using so many slides, I didn't realize the whole stress on the listener. That's a really powerful point. That's all leads back to Zoom fatigue, and suddenly it becomes this vicious circle. One quick question to play off of that. One thing that we've been sharing with Tony, I'm curious just from your expertise, we share with clients as well, when you're here in this virtual platform, when you suddenly share a slide, now the picture of you, your tile here gets really tiny. and we put all this focus into a distraction, which in my eyes, I'm thinking you're making it so much harder for your listeners to pay attention to you when there's a big slide right there in front of them on their screen.
Hmm. Yep, that's some of what we've seen as well. So when the time comes to have that discussion, to have that Q&A, if you have the same slide up for 5 or 10 minutes, people are likely not looking at that. From what we've seen from our eye tracking glasses, they're looking at the tiny little screens. So rather than make that kind of complicated for them, why not stop sharing for a moment so that all of the tiny tiles become bigger tiles? So then it feels like you're having a real live discussion with folks, and you're not in this sort of simulated environment where there's the same slides stuck up there and you're having to really focus to try and engage visually with each person speaking on the call.
You've given so much information, and everyone, I promised Tony I would make this short and sweet because I just want kind of like a sneak preview, and maybe we get a chance, Tony, to have you back. If you take everything that you just covered, and I know I didn't prep you for this, I'm throwing you underneath the bus a little bit, Tony. What would be that one takeaway? I know there's a lot here. That one takeaway for our listeners who realize they might be in a situation where they're not going back to work anytime soon. They don't know when they're going to go back, or they are going back to work, but it's heavily hybrid, and this is their world for a while. That one takeaway, Tony, to make sure that they manage Zoom fatigue, that they're still influencing their listeners to take action above all this noise.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think really making sure that you emphasize your 10% key messages is key. There's so many ways in which the audience, the clients, won't be able to remember everything you have to tell them, no matter what format you put it in, no matter how you share it with them. But if you take a step back before your presentation, before your meeting, and try and articulate what you think the most important aspects of that conversation need to be, that 10%, and then go back in and really emphasize that at the beginning of the presentation, at the end, same thing within each slide or each segment, then above all else, that should stick with the client. If you don't do that and you assume that it's sort of embedded within there, well, everything we've seen suggests that's like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's unrealistic to expect them to walk away with, at the very least, that 10% message you care about. So I'd say that's probably the number one thing is just making sure if you have to reduce things down and simplify, you do that ahead of time and then go back over and kind of reorchestrate your slides so that comes out.
That's powerful because I think all of what you're talking about, whether we are in person, whether we're hybrid, or whether we're 100% virtual, all of this still applies. Some really powerful things. Is there a resource that you would recommend for our listeners, or a search that they could do if they want to find out more information?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I have an answer for you for that.
Okay, well, you stay tuned, because if you do, all of our listeners, I'll make sure that I share a link with you. Tony, thank you. Thanks for sharing your expertise with our clients. I so value the partnership that you and I have and the work that you do. I truly value that what you do right now has more power than it ever has, being that we're still trying to navigate not just virtual, but soon to really navigate the hybrid world as well. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me on here. And hopefully we can do more of these sessions in the future.
Of course, you're welcome. Take care.